The void left behind. The mansion stood in quiet reverence beneath the fading light of the evening sky. Its towering pillars, sharp angles, and intricate stonework seemed almost like the remains of a forgotten era, standing against time itself. The landscape surrounding it was meticulously groomed, a reflection of the wealth and power it housed. Yet inside, the space felt as if it had been forgotten altogether. The silence was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the grand-grandfather clock that ticked relentlessly in the distance. Elliot Parker stood by the towering windows of the grand foyer, gazing out at the expansive gardens beyond. The light of the setting sun, vibrant and warm, bathed everything in its path, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into eternity. For a moment, it felt as though the world outside had an answer, as if the beautiful horizon held the secret to his aching heart. Yet, even with such beauty before him, all he could feel was an overwhelming emptiness, like the gaping hole of grief was swallowing him whole. The floor beneath his polished Italian shoes was cold and unyielding, the marble's sheen reflecting only the sorrow that clung to him. Each step he took seemed distant from the man he had once been. A man full of vitality, optimism, and love. That man was long gone, replaced by someone who no longer knew how to smile without the hollow weight of loss pressing down on him. Elliot's mind wandered back to the days when laughter had echoed through these halls, to the evenings when the soft glow of candlelight flickered against the walls and filled the rooms with warmth. Sarah, his wife, the love of his life, had been the heart of this home. Her gentle spirit, her laughter, and the way she had lit up every room she entered had turned their house into a sanctuary. But that was before the accident, before the car crash that had stolen her away, leaving Elliot to navigate a world he no longer understood. As the memory of that night resurfaced, a tightness gripped his chest. He remembered the frantic calls, the ambulance, the hours spent in a sterile hospital room, desperately waiting for any good news that would never come. But it wasn't the accident itself that haunted him most. It was the absence, the void, the deafening silence in their home, the way everything felt wrong without her. He turned away from the window, his gaze falling on the long hallway that stretched ahead. His footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness, a sound so foreign in a home that had once been filled with vibrant life. Each portrait hanging on the walls seemed to taunt him with memories of what he had lost. Sarah in her wedding dress, her radiant smile, the gleam of happiness in her eyes, their shared moments of joy frozen in time. His eyes lingered on one portrait in particular, Sarah standing by a garden, holding a bouquet of roses, laughing with a carefree expression that he hadn't seen in years. It seemed almost like a dream to him now, so distant and unreachable. The love they had shared felt like it had been from another lifetime, one he would never return to. A sharp pain pierced through his chest as his breath caught in his throat. He hadn't let himself feel this way in months, hadn't allowed himself to truly grieve. He had thrown himself into his work, into the empire that had been built from nothing, hoping that the weight of responsibilities would numb the ache. But it hadn't worked. Nothing worked. The pain of losing Sarah never went away. And now, the emptiness was all-consuming. With a sigh, he ran a hand through his graying hair and turned down the hallway toward the study. His footsteps were slower now, measured, like someone who had learned to tread carefully through a life full of unexpected sharp edges. The study was dark, the heavy curtains drawn shut against the evening light. It was his sanctuary, his place of solitude, where he could hide from the world and its endless demands. As he approached the desk, his eyes fell on a framed photograph, one that had been placed near the corner. An image of him and Sarah, taken on their honeymoon. The photo was candid, a rare moment caught between laughter and quiet conversation. They had been so happy then, so in love. Elliot reached for the photograph, his fingers brushing lightly over the glass. The moment it touched his skin, the floodgates opened. The memories came crashing in, relentless and overwhelming. He could hear her laugh, see her smile, feel the warmth of her touch. It had all been so real, so vivid. But now it was nothing more than a distant echo in the back of his mind, forever out of reach. The tears that had long been buried rose to the surface. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he let the emotions overwhelm him. His hand shook as he set the photograph back on the desk, not trusting himself to hold it any longer. The pain, the loss, it was all too much. And yet, he couldn't stop. He couldn't let go of her. Just as quickly as the tears came, the storm of emotion subsided, leaving him drained, hollow and empty once more. He let out a long, shaky breath and stood up, trying to steady himself. This was the reality of his life now. Grief was a constant companion. No matter how many years passed, he knew he would never truly heal. Elliot. The soft voice broke through the silence like a whisper in the dark, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see his sister, Lily, standing in the doorway. Her face was soft with concern, but there was something in her eyes that told him she knew he had been struggling. She had seen him this way countless times before, lost in his own sorrow, unable to move forward. "Are you all right?" she asked, stepping into the room with a gentle grace. Lily had always been the one who could get through to him, the one who had been there when Sarah had passed, trying to help him piece together the shattered fragments of his life. Elliot didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked to the window, gazing out at the expanse of land that seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him. His fingers gripped the edge of the windowsill, feeling the cool glass against his skin. "Sometimes I wonder," he said, his voice hoarse, "if I'll ever get out of this hole, this endless void." He paused, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I can't breathe, Lily. It feels like I'm suffocating in this house, in this life." Lily approached him, her presence comforting in the midst of his despair. She stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You know that's not true, right? You're not alone in this. You don't have to carry it all by yourself." Elliot's jaw tightened, and he looked at her, his expression one of quiet resistance. "I'm not sure I even know how to live anymore, Lily. Everything reminds me of her." He let out a shaky breath. "How am I supposed to move on when it feels like she's everywhere?" Lily sighed softly, her gaze turning toward the vast gardens outside. "Maybe you don't have to move on. Maybe you just need to take the next step forward. I know it's hard, but you have to start somewhere." Elliot shook his head, turning back to her with a frown. "And what? Replace her with someone else?" Lily raised an eyebrow, but her expression remained gentle. "No one's asking you to replace her, but there's someone who needs you, Elliot. Someone who could fill the space that's been empty for far too long." Elliot frowned, not understanding where she was going with this. "What do you mean?" Lily hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I've been talking to an orphanage. There's a little girl there. Her name is Amara. She's 5 years old, and she's been through a lot. She doesn't have anyone, Elliot. No family. No home." Elliot looked at his sister, a mixture of confusion and reluctance in his eyes. "What are you asking, Lily?" "I'm asking you to take her in," Lily said quietly. "She needs someone to love her, to give her a family. And I think you need that too." Elliot stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It was a difficult thing to ask, and part of him wanted to refuse. He wasn't ready to open his heart to anyone again, but as he looked at his sister, her gentle eyes filled with hope, something inside him shifted. Maybe it wasn't about replacing Sarah. Maybe it was about healing. Maybe it was about letting love in again, even in the smallest of ways. "Where is she?" Elliot asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lily smiled, a glimmer of hope lighting up her face. "She's waiting for you." The girl who changed everything. The drive to the orphanage felt like an eternity, despite the fact that it was only a few miles away from the mansion. Elliot found himself unable to focus on the passing scenery, his mind racing in circles. He had agreed to meet the little girl, Amara, but what he didn't understand was why Lily had pushed so hard for him to take her in. Could a child really fill the void left by Sarah? How could someone so young bring any healing to a soul as fractured as his? As the car rolled slowly through the gates of the orphanage, Elliot's fingers drummed nervously against the armrest. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears, a constant reminder of the life he was stepping into. One he hadn't wanted, not without Sarah. He was used to being in control of his world, of managing his emotions with the sharp precision he applied to his business deals. But this felt different. This felt personal. The orphanage was a large old building, nestled in the corner of a quiet street. It had once been a grand house, its peeling paint and overgrown ivy giving it a melancholic, abandoned air. Despite its weathered exterior, the sounds of children's laughter could be heard echoing from within, alive with energy, with hope. Elliot stepped out of the car, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. He hesitated for a moment, looking up at the towering building as if it were a mountain to climb. His chest tightened at the thought of what was about to happen. He wasn't ready. He wasn't ready for this little girl to change his life. But there was no going back now. Lily had already gone inside, speaking to the headmistress, and as Elliot walked up the path, his eyes caught sight of a figure standing by the door. The little girl, Amara. She was small, no more than 5 years old, and stood with her back slightly hunched, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, clutching something against her chest. Her hair, dark and curly, framed her face in a wild mess of untamed strands, and her big brown eyes seemed to shimmer with uncertainty. She looked so fragile, so out of place in the world of adults that surrounded her. Elliot felt a sudden rush of emotions. He could see the pain in her eyes, the confusion, the loneliness. It was a reflection of what he had seen in his own mirror day after day since Sarah's death. But this little girl had none of the luxury of time that he had. She had no one to guide her through the darkness. And perhaps that was why, despite his own hesitations, he felt a strange tug at his heart, a feeling of protectiveness, of responsibility. Lily's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but firm. "Elliot, this is Amara." Elliot's gaze shifted toward his sister. Lily's face was alight with anticipation, her eyes filled with hope. She had done this before, had been through the process of adoption countless times, but there was something different about this moment, something that felt like destiny. Amara lifted her gaze to meet his, and for a brief, suspended moment, their eyes locked. There was a strange connection between them, a silent understanding, as if something deep inside her had recognized something deep inside him. Amara didn't smile, but neither did she flinch or hide her eyes. Instead, she simply watched him, waiting. Elliot took a tentative step forward, his voice low and tentative. "Hi, Amara," he said, his words stumbling slightly as he forced a smile. "I'm Elliot. I think you and I are going to be spending a lot of time together." Amara didn't respond at first. She just continued to study him, her small hands tightening their grip around the object she was clutching. Elliot felt his heart ache at the sight. What was it that she was holding onto so tightly? Was it something important? Something that tied her to her past? Lily stepped forward, her voice gentle. "Amara, do you want to show Mr. Parker what you've been holding?" Slowly, Amara nodded, her movements cautious and deliberate. She uncrossed her arms and held out her hands, revealing a small worn necklace, its chain a delicate gold, and hanging from it, a small pendant in the shape of a star. The pendant was scratched and slightly tarnished, but despite its wear, it shone with a quiet brilliance. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. It was the necklace, the same necklace he had once seen in Sarah's jewelry box, the one that had vanished before the accident. He could hardly believe it, and yet there it was, hanging from this small girl's neck like an unspoken bond, a connection to his wife that he had long thought lost. "How did you?" His voice faltered. "How did you get that?" Amara's eyes flicked to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as if she might not answer, but then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "It's my mama's. She said, her words careful as though weighing each syllable. She gave it to me before she went away. She said it would help me find someone who could take care of me. The words hung heavy in the air, and Elliot's entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He took a step back, his mind racing, trying to process the information. The pendant. The same pendant. How could this be? How could it be connected to Sarah? Was it possible that Amara's mother and Sarah had known each other? Was there some link between their pasts that he had never considered? His mind swirled with questions, but before he could speak again, Lily placed a gentle hand on his arm, offering a quiet reassurance. Elliot, I know this is a lot to take in, but the timing, it's strange, isn't it? Maybe this is why we met her. Elliot barely heard his sister's words as his gaze stayed fixed on the pendant. A memory flickered in his mind. Sarah, on their wedding day, her fingers brushing against the star-shaped pendant as she had smiled at him, her eyes full of love. I never want to lose this, she had whispered. It reminds me of everything that matters. But now, here it was, wrapped around this little girl's neck. Amara. Elliot's voice cracked as he kneeled down to meet her at eye level. Where did you get this? Who gave it to you? Amara shifted uneasily under his gaze. She looked down at the necklace, her small fingers tracing the shape of the star with gentle reverence. My mama gave it to me before she went away. She said it would help me find someone who could love me. Elliot felt a lump rise in his throat. The world had just shifted beneath his feet. Could it be possible? Was this little girl somehow tied to Sarah's past? Could she really be a sign that his journey toward healing was about to begin? With the girl standing before him, he realized something that shook him to the core. He wasn't sure who was about to save whom. The weight of unanswered questions. Elliot stood frozen, his eyes locked on the small, worn pendant hanging around Amara's neck. The world around him seemed to slow, every detail magnified in the wake of the revelation. It was as though the room itself held its breath, waiting for him to make sense of it all. Amara's innocent gaze remained fixed on him, her hand still gently clutching the necklace, unaware of the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. Lily, standing quietly by his side, had noticed the shift in her brother's demeanor. She, too, could see the deepening confusion and the weight of emotions he was struggling to process. But there was a quiet strength in her, an understanding of the depth of the moment. She didn't press him. Instead, she simply waited, her presence a steady anchor in the tumultuous sea of Elliot's thoughts. Elliot finally found his voice, though it was low and hesitant. This is impossible, he muttered to himself more than anyone else. How could it be the same necklace? Lily stepped forward, her tone soft but firm. Elliot, I know you're confused. I am too. But maybe this isn't a coincidence. Maybe this little girl. She trailed off, unsure of what to say next, as if unsure whether or not to share the thoughts forming in her own mind. Amara shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension in the air. Her small hand instinctively reached up to clutch the necklace again, her fingers wrapping around it like a lifeline. She didn't fully understand what was happening around her, but she could feel the significance of the object she wore. It was something her mama had given her, something that had kept her going through the uncertainty of her young life. Lily crouched down to Amara's level, offering a gentle smile. Sweetheart, do you mind if Mr. Parker holds the necklace for a moment? I think it would help him understand why it's so important. Amara hesitated, her big brown eyes darting between Lily and Elliot. But something in Lily's calm demeanor eased her unease. She nodded slightly and carefully unwrapped her fingers from the necklace, offering it to Elliot. Elliot took the small, delicate piece of jewelry into his hands, his fingers brushing lightly against its surface. The gold was warm from Amara's touch, but the pendant, despite its wear, still seemed to shimmer with a faint glow. He turned it over in his palm, tracing the smooth curves of the star, his mind racing with 100 unanswered questions. Where did you get this, Amara? Elliot asked, his voice strained, his breath shallow. How could it be connected to Sarah? Amara looked up at him, her small face furrowing with confusion. I told you, My mama gave it to me. She said it would help me find someone who would take care of me." Elliot swallowed hard, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. His fingers lingered on the pendant, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he could feel Sarah's presence. Just the faintest whisper of her touch, as if she were reaching out to him from the other side. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Sarah was gone, and yet, this little girl, this orphan, seemed to be the key to something he didn't yet understand. Lily observed her brother carefully, her eyes searching his face for any sign of recognition. She knew him well enough to understand that he was close to something, but what she couldn't say. His mind was working, trying to piece together the puzzle that had been handed to him, a puzzle that had no clear picture, no obvious answers. "You need to find out more, Elliot," Lily said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "You need to ask the right questions. There's something here, something important." Elliot nodded, but his gaze never left the necklace. The memories of Sarah, the love they had shared, the dreams they had built together, all of it seemed to come rushing back in an overwhelming flood. But now, there was a new question on the table. Could this little girl, Amara, really be a part of his past? Could she hold the key to some connection he had never known? He turned to Lily, his mind still reeling. "Do you know anything about Amara's mother?" he asked. "Who was she? How does she know Sarah?" Lily's expression darkened slightly, as if she were treading on fragile ground. "I don't know much. I'm still gathering information. The orphanage didn't give me many details about her background. But," she paused, her voice lowering, as if she were about to reveal something she wasn't sure she should. "But I do know that Amara's mother had a similar necklace, a necklace just like the one Amara is wearing. They said it was passed down through generations in her family." Elliot felt the breath leave his chest. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. Amara's mother had worn a necklace like the one that had once belonged to Sarah. It was too much to process, too many strange coincidences stacking up against him. Do you think she's related to Sarah?" Elliot asked, his voice cracking. The thought had formed in his mind, but he wasn't sure he could say it out loud. Lily met his gaze, her eyes filled with empathy. "I don't know, Elliot, but I think it's worth finding out. There's something about this girl, something you can't ignore." Elliot turned back to Amara, who had silently watched the exchange, her eyes wide but unblinking. The weight of the necklace in his hand felt heavier now, as if it carried with it a burden he hadn't anticipated. "Amara," Elliot said, his voice softer now, gentler, "where did your mama live? Do you remember her telling you where she came from?" Amara tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowed as she thought. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, as if trying to dredge up a memory from a time long past. Then, her small voice broke the silence. "I think she said she lived in a big house. Like this one," Amara said, pointing vaguely at the mansion. "She said it was a place with lots of windows. I don't remember much else. But she always told me stories about a lady who looked like me. She said she was brave and strong, like her mama." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. The way Amara spoke about her mother, the way she described the house, something about it felt all too familiar. His mind raced again, but the pieces didn't fit together. What was it about the description that pulled at him so strongly? He couldn't place it, but it felt like a door had just cracked open, revealing a path he hadn't been prepared to follow. Lily stepped forward, her hand resting on Elliot's arm, grounding him in the moment. "Elliot, I know this is overwhelming, but you need to take the next step. Start asking the questions. Start looking for answers. This little girl, she's connected to something much bigger than we can see right now." Elliot took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing on him with greater intensity than ever before. He had come here looking for something he wasn't even sure he could articulate, something to fill the aching emptiness inside him. But now, he realized, the answer might not come from the past. It might come from the future, from this little girl who seemed to hold a piece of his heart in her tiny hands. He turned back to Amara, who was still clutching the necklace, her eyes wide and searching for something she couldn't name. Elliot smiled at her, the first genuine smile he had felt in months. "All right," he said softly, the decision made. "We'll figure this out. Together." And in that moment, Elliot knew that his life was about to change forever. The unraveling. The following days passed in a blur of uncertainty and discovery. Elliot spent hours pacing the grand hallways of his mansion, his mind constantly circling back to the same questions. Amara's presence in his life had thrown everything into disarray. She had become a quiet yet undeniable force in his world, demanding answers and reshaping the future he had been so certain of. He hadn't expected to be drawn to her in this way. He had agreed to take her in, to honor his late wife's wishes, but somewhere along the way, something had changed. There was a connection between them, something invisible yet tangible, a thread that seemed to tie his broken past to a future he couldn't yet comprehend. It was in the necklace, yes, but it was more than that. It was the way she had looked at him when they first met, the quiet sadness in her eyes, the way she instinctively reached out to him when the world felt too big. Elliot had tried to keep his distance, at first. He told himself he was doing what was right, that he was helping her heal. But as the days turned into weeks, his resolve weakened. Amara wasn't just a child in need of a home. She was a reminder of everything he had lost, a silent echo of his wife, a glimpse into a past he had buried deep inside. It had been a week since they had first met, and Elliot couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that had taken root in his chest. There was something more to Amara than what she was telling him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Every time he looked at her, he felt an inexplicable sense of déjà vu, as if he had seen her before, as if their paths had crossed long ago in a life that seemed like another world entirely. He had spent the last few days digging through old photographs, letters, anything he could find that might provide him with some clue about the necklace, about Amara's mother. But so far, all his efforts had been in vain. There were no records, no mention of anyone with the same description, no connection to Sarah's past that he could find. And yet there it was, the necklace. It was the same one his wife had worn, the one that had mysteriously disappeared after the accident. Late one evening, Elliot found himself in the mansion's study, the dim light of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. His eyes were bloodshot from hours of searching, his mind growing weary from the unanswered questions. He leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the edges of the desk, frustration seeping into his bones. The sound of soft footsteps broke the silence, and he looked up to see Amara standing in the doorway, her small figure silhouetted against the soft light from the hallway. "Mr. Parker," she said, her voice small and hesitant. "Can I come in?" Elliot smiled wearily at her, the familiar ache in his chest rising again. "Of course, Amara. Come in." She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, her bare feet making barely a sound on the polished floor. Her eyes, always so observant, scanned the room before settling on him. She had been quiet all day, almost too quiet, and for the first time, Elliot noticed how deeply she seemed to be taking in her new surroundings. The mansion, so large and cold, seemed like a strange place for a child to grow up. It had never felt so empty before. Amara walked over to the desk, her eyes flicking between the scattered papers and photographs that littered the surface. She then looked back at Elliot, her small voice breaking the silence. "You're looking for something, aren't you?" Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to be so perceptive, to pick up on the quiet desperation in his search. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady himself before speaking. "I'm trying to understand something, Amara," he said, his voice low. "Something about the necklace you wear, something about your mama." Amara stepped closer to him, her tiny hands clasped in front of her. She looked up at him with those large, dark eyes, eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "She told me to find you," Amara said quietly. "She said you would help me." The words were like a punch to the gut. Amara's mother had known. She had known that Elliot would be the one to help her daughter. But how could that be? How could anyone have known that their paths would cross like this? Your mama knew me, Elliot asked, his voice barely a whisper. Amara nodded slowly, her gaze never wavering. She said you were a good man, that you'd know what to do when the time came. Elliot felt a shiver run down his spine. What did she mean by that? What was it that Sarah had known, something that had been hidden from him for all these years? What had Amara's mother seen in him that he hadn't been able to see in himself? He stood up suddenly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Where is she, Amara? He asked, his voice strained. Where is your mama now? Amara didn't flinch at the intensity in his voice. She simply looked down at the necklace around her neck, her fingers tracing its surface with the same reverence she always seemed to show it. She's gone, she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. But she left me this. She said it would protect me. Elliot's heart ached as he knelt down to her level, his hand shaking slightly as he reached out to touch her small shoulders. Amara, he began, his voice softer now. I need to understand what happened. I need to know the truth. Please, tell me what your mama said. Amara bit her lip, her gaze flickering as if she were searching for the right words. She said there was a secret that could fix everything. She said it was in the past, that if I found the right person, they would know what to do. Elliot stared at her, feeling the weight of her words settle on him like a heavy cloak. A secret that could fix everything. Was this about Sarah? Was this about something he had missed? Something from their life together that had been hidden from him? He stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the room. His mind was spinning with possibilities, with fragments of memories that refused to fit together. I need to find out more, he muttered to himself. I need to know everything. Amara stood silently in the corner, watching him with a quiet intensity. There's a place, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. A place my mama told me about. It's where the secret is. Elliot froze, his heart racing. Where? Amara smiled faintly, her eyes distant, as if she were remembering something she had once heard, something long buried. It's in the woods. A house. She said it would be waiting for you. The hidden truth. Elliot's mind buzzed with a mix of disbelief and urgency. A house in the woods. What could Amara possibly mean by that? He had heard the stories, whispers of old estates and forgotten histories tied to hidden legacies. But this felt different. This was something far more personal, and the fact that Amara, a 5-year-old girl, was the one to reveal it, made the mystery all the more inexplicable. His eyes flickered to Amara, still standing silently in the corner of the study, her expression unreadable. She was so small, so fragile, yet in that moment, she seemed older, as if the weight of her past had forced her to grow up too quickly. And the necklace, always clutched close to her chest, gleamed faintly under the dim light. It was as though it were alive, holding the key to a secret that had been waiting for years to be uncovered. Where in the woods? Elliot asked, trying to steady his voice. The gravity of the situation was sinking in, and he needed answers. Where exactly is this house, Amara? She didn't immediately answer, her gaze distant, as if she were traveling back in time to a place she could barely remember. It's not far. I don't know how far, but it's close. She told me it would be easy to find when the time was right. The urgency in her voice left Elliot with little room to question the logic of a child. He knew there was no more time to waste. If this place, this house, truly existed, it could be the key to everything. The key to understanding what had happened to Sarah, to unraveling the strange connection between her and Amara. But why hadn't he ever heard of it before? Why had Sarah never mentioned it to him? And more pressing still, why was it Amara who had been entrusted with the knowledge of this house and its secret? I'll take you there, Elliot said, his decision made in an instant. He didn't fully understand what they were walking into, but the need for answers burned within him. He had no choice now but to follow where the thread led. Lily had been standing quietly at the door, watching the exchange. Her concern for her brother was evident, her brow furrowed with a mixture of apprehension and doubt. "Elliot, wait," she said, her voice laced with caution. "You can't just rush into this. We don't know what we're dealing with. It could be dangerous." Elliot turned to face her, his eyes filled with a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. "Lily, I have to do this. I don't understand it yet, but I have to find out what's going on. For Amara, for Sarah, for me." Lily's expression softened as she looked at him, her concern giving way to understanding. "I know you want answers, but we don't know what's waiting for us out there. It might be more than just answers. Please, take someone with you." Elliot shook his head. "I'll be fine. I'm doing this alone. I have to." She didn't argue further. There was a certain finality in his tone, a certainty that made it clear he wasn't going to back down. And in that moment, Lily realized she couldn't stop him. He had already made up his mind. Later that evening, after making the necessary arrangements, Elliot found himself driving down an old, winding road that led deep into the countryside. Amara sat in the passenger seat beside him, her small hands folded in her lap, the necklace still clutched tightly around her neck. The air outside was crisp and cold, the sky a blanket of stars overhead, yet the world seemed impossibly quiet. There was no sound but the hum of the engine, no sign of life but the trees that lined the road, casting long shadows in the moonlight. Elliot glanced at Amara occasionally, trying to gauge her emotions. She seemed calm, but there was a quiet intensity in her demeanor that unsettled him. She wasn't a typical child. There was an oldness to her, a wisdom far beyond her years, as if she had lived 1,000 lifetimes in her short span of 5. "Amara," Elliot said, his voice gentle. "Are you sure about this? Are you sure this is the place your mama told you about?" She nodded, her eyes focused ahead, never leaving the dark road ahead of them. "Yes, I remember. It's where she said the secret was. It's where she said you would find the answers." Elliot swallowed hard. The weight of those words sat heavily in the air between them, and for a brief moment, he almost turned the car around. What if this was a mistake? What if it was too late to fix whatever had gone wrong? But there was no turning back now. There was no way to undo what had already been set in motion. He could only move forward. The car came to a stop at the edge of a dense forest, the road now little more than a narrow trail barely visible in the moonlight. A faint mist clung to the ground, rising up from the forest floor like a shroud. And for a moment, Elliot felt as though they had crossed into another world. There was something eerie about the place, something ancient and forgotten. But Amara seemed unfazed. She opened the car door without a word and stepped out into the cool night air, her small figure barely visible in the darkness. Elliot followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew that he had to follow Amara. She was the key. She was the guide to this hidden truth, no matter how improbable it seemed. Amara began to walk, her pace steady as she led him into the forest. The trees towered above them, their branches weaving together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves beneath their feet. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, Elliot's mind racing with thoughts and questions he couldn't quiet. He wanted to ask Amara more, to demand answers, but something in her stillness told him to remain patient. The time for questions would come. For now, they had to reach the house. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they arrived at a clearing. In the center stood a house, an old, decaying mansion, its stone walls cracked and weathered with age. Vines crawled up the sides, and the windows, though dark, seemed to hold an otherworldly presence, as if they were watching. The house seemed abandoned, forgotten by time, yet there was an undeniable sense of familiarity about it. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the place Sarah had told Amara about. But how? Why hadn't he ever seen it before? How had it remained hidden for so long? Amara reached out and placed her hand on the rusted gate that stood between them and the house. It creaked as she pushed it open, the sound sharp in the stillness of the night. "We're here," she whispered. Elliot followed her inside, his heart racing, every step heavier than the last. The house was dark and cold, its once grandiose hallways now dusty and forgotten. It was clear that no one had lived here in years, perhaps decades, and yet, as they made their way deeper into the house, Elliot felt an odd sense of peace settle over him. The air seemed to hum with the energy of a past long buried. Amara led him to a small room at the back of the house, where the remnants of a fire long extinguished still smoldered faintly in the hearth. At the center of the room was a wooden chest, old and worn, its surface scarred with age. "This is it," Amara said, her voice quiet but certain. Elliot stood in front of the chest, his hand shaking as he knelt to open it. Inside, he found a collection of papers, old photographs, and letters, each one more personal than the last. As he sifted through them, he felt the pieces of the puzzle start to fall into place. The chest contained a story that had been kept hidden for far too long. And at the heart of that story was a truth so shocking, so life-altering, that it would change everything Elliot thought he knew about himself, about Sarah, and about Amara. The final revelation. The chest creaked open as Elliot carefully lifted the stack of old papers. Each page felt like a fragile thread in a tapestry that had been lost to time, yet the weight of their significance was undeniable. He could feel it deep in his bones, the sense that within these forgotten remnants of the past lay the answers to everything he had been searching for. The necklace, the mysterious house, Amara's connection to Sarah, all of it was coming together. And the truth was finally within his reach. Elliot's hands trembled slightly as he picked up a worn photograph. It was a picture of a younger Sarah, her face glowing with joy as she stood next to a man whose face was obscured by shadows. But there was something in the way she held herself, the tenderness in her smile, that made Elliot's heart ache with the unmistakable familiarity of their shared history. The man beside her. He looked so familiar, yet Elliot couldn't place him. He flipped the photo over, his eyes scanning the faded ink on the back. "To my dearest Sarah, forever bound by the love we shared, I hope this small token brings you the peace we both seek, always and forever." Elliot's pulse quickened as his eyes moved to the name signed at the bottom. Victor Kensington. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Victor Kensington, his great-grandfather. A name that had been buried in the archives of the family estate, a name long forgotten. But why had Sarah kept this photo? Why had she kept it hidden away for all these years? He turned the page, his mind racing. The next photograph was of a much younger Sarah holding a baby in her arms. The baby's face was partially obscured by shadows, but the faint outline of a necklace glimmered against the fabric of the baby's tiny dress. Amara's necklace. He stared at the picture for a long moment, unable to process the connection. But it was undeniable. The child in the photo was Amara. How could that be? How could Sarah have known Amara as a baby, and yet Amara had never been part of their lives? His thoughts scattered as he turned the pages faster, desperate for more answers. Each letter he unfolded, each photograph he uncovered, seemed to bring more questions than solutions. The mystery deepened with every step, the web of secrets only becoming more intricate. But the final letter, a letter that had been tucked deep within the chest, was different. It was addressed to him. His name, written in Sarah's delicate handwriting, sent a chill down his spine. With hands that shook more violently than before, Elliot carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside was yellowed with age, fragile and worn, as if it had been held in someone's hands countless times over the years. He began to read. "Elliot, my love, if you're reading this, it means I am no longer with you. It means that I've kept a secret from you, one that has weighed on my heart for many years. I have failed you, and I am sorry. Please understand, it was never my intention to keep this from you. But when I first met Amara, I knew something was wrong. There was a bond between us, a connection I couldn't explain. I didn't know then that our lives were intertwined, that our fates were connected in ways neither of us could understand. But what I do know, and what I hope you will one day understand, is that Amara is more than just a child. She is our daughter, my daughter. The words blurred in front of his eyes as his heart began to race. Our daughter. The phrase repeated over and over in his mind, refusing to settle. Sarah's letter continued. I was young when I met Victor Kensington, and he promised me everything, a life of wealth, security, and peace. But there was something about him, something I couldn't ignore. He wanted me to be his, to bear his children. I resisted, but the power he held over me was undeniable. When I found out I was pregnant with Amara, I thought my life was over. I knew what Victor would do to me and the child. He had plans for me that I couldn't escape. So I made a decision. I ran. I took Amara and left everything behind. I disappeared from the world I had once known. But Victor never stopped looking for us. I feared that one day he would find us. So I kept our secret hidden from everyone, even from you. I wanted to keep you safe, to keep our life together intact. But now, with Amara growing up, I realize that I can no longer keep the truth from you. You deserve to know. You deserve to understand what brought us here. Please, my love, forgive me. The words danced before his eyes, each sentence like a bombshell. His mind struggled to process the reality of it all. Amara, his daughter. His heart pounded as he reread the letter, trying to piece together the fragments of the past. Sarah had known the truth. She had kept it from him for so long, but she had always known. She had always known that Amara was their child, their flesh and blood. The shock was overwhelming. For years, Elliot had believed that he had lost his chance at happiness when Sarah died. He had believed that his grief, his loneliness, was something he had to bear in silence, that he was meant to suffer in the absence of the woman he had loved. But now it seemed that Sarah had left him a gift, a precious, irreplaceable gift. His daughter. His daughter. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, drowning him in a mix of joy, sorrow, and guilt. He had spent so much time grieving for Sarah, for the love they had lost, that he hadn't even noticed the life that had been right in front of him. Amara wasn't just a reminder of his past. She was his future. She was the living, breathing proof that Sarah had loved him until the very end, and that their love had never truly died. Tears welled up in his eyes as he looked up at Amara, who stood silently beside him. She hadn't spoken, hadn't moved since he began reading the letter, but there was something in the way she held herself, something in the quiet strength she exuded, that spoke volumes. She had always known. She had always carried the weight of their shared secret. Amara, Elliot whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I never knew. I never knew you were mine. Amara's eyes softened, and she took a small step toward him. You don't have to say anything, Mr. Parker. I'm just glad you know now. Elliot's heart swelled with a love so deep, so profound, that it threatened to break him. He reached out to her, his arms trembling as he pulled her into a gentle embrace. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his grief lift, replaced by something far more powerful, a bond that had been forged by blood, by love, and by fate. The truth, as devastating as it had been, had set him free. The secret was no longer hidden. And as he held Amara in his arms, Elliot finally understood that the past, no matter how painful, had brought him to this moment, a moment of redemption, of healing, and of love.